Have you ever heard of the evil God hypothesis that Stephen Law popularized or came up with?
Tell me it.
So the idea is that, imagine that there's a God who brings about the world and creates the world, but does it maliciously because he wants human beings to suffer. He brings about a world in order so that human beings will suffer.
Alex O'Connor, who is undeniably the true AOC, recently appeared on Jubilee's Surrounded, a YouTube program where Alex got to defend his atheism against 20 Christians.
Hi, my name's Alex O'Connor. I'm an atheist and host of the Within Reason podcast, and today I'm surrounded by 25 Christians who, God willing, might be able to change my mind.
I wanted to respond to Alex from the perspective of someone who is perhaps a bit more heterodoxical than the Christians he was debating with that day. I am a Christian, but I also hold views that are perhaps a bit out of the ordinary, and I think perhaps vainly that I have something to add to this conversation. Alex's first claim is about suffering.
My first claim is that suffering makes God's existence unlikely.
This is, of course, for most people, the most substantive argument against God's existence. But I would argue that this is more of an emotional argument than it is a philosophical or theological argument. Now, that's not to detract from the argument. I think it's precisely because it's an emotional argument that it's such a compelling one. But it is to say that we have to orient ourselves correctly, both to steelman Alex's argument and to give possible answers to it that are authentic and genuine. Firstly, it's not a good philosophical argument. The problem of evil on its face is not compelling when in its logical form. And I'm not sure Alex would disagree with me on this. I think this is the reason Alex phrases the question in terms of suffering and not in terms of evil. The logical problem of evil states that there is a logical contradiction between God's omnipotence, him being all-powerful, his omnibenevolence, being all good, and allowing evil to exist in reality. Open theists try to solve this by saying that God puts limits on his power. Others, including myself, would say that in the same way darkness doesn't exist in the ontological sense and it's just the absence of light, and cold doesn't exist for the same reason because it's an absence of heat, that evil doesn't have any ontological validity and is simply the absence of God. But the evidential problem of evil is the one Alex seems to focus on and cuts to the root of the problem further by really making it the evidential problem of suffering. This, in my opinion, is the harder argument to take on. There is, in my opinion, no better example of the stark distinction between a philosophical problem of suffering and the boots-on-the-ground emotional reality of suffering than C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis wrote a very well-written Theosis all about the problem of pain, called, well, The Problem of Pain. Lewis was no stranger to emotional, psychological, and physical suffering when he wrote this book. His mother died when he was very young, he served in World War I, and he undoubtedly had his fair share of suffering. Yet when his wife Joy was diagnosed with cancer and died a slow, agonizing death, this hit Lewis in a cutting way that radically changed him. He wrote in his journal through the grieving process in what will be published as A Grief Observed, a raw, brutal read that details his anger with God, his doubts, and his reeling mind. The book was so raw, so heterodoxical, so brutally honest that C.S. Lewis published it under a pseudonym, and it was only republished with his name on it after his death. Here are the types of quotes we find in this book. No, my real fear is not of materialism. If it were true, we, or what we mistake for we, could get out, get from under the harrow. An overdose of sleeping pills would do it. I am more afraid that we are really rats in a trap, or worse still, rats in a laboratory. Someone said, I believe, God always geometrizes. Supposing the truth were, God always vivisects. Sooner or later, I must face the question in plain language. What reason have we, except our own desperate wishes, to believe that God is, by any standard we can conceive, good? Doesn't all the prima facie evidence suggest exactly the opposite? What have we to set against it? When I read A Grief Observed some 15 years ago, I didn't know what the word vivisection meant. It means to dissect something while that organism is still alive. Later on, Lewis will opine that perhaps God is the cosmic sadist, an eternal vivisector. But that above quote is just a longer written version of Alex's own prompt and expresses the exact same sentiment. So I want to ground this in emotion because I think that's the thrust of Alex's issues. C.S. Lewis wrote his Theodicy, a defense against the problem of evil, and it's filled with rationality and logic and argumentation and intellectual explanation. But when his suffering reached a fever pitch in his personal life, he wrote a very different book, one that was raw, visceral, honest, existential, and I think Alex's prompt falls more into A Grief Observed than it does the problem of pain. I'm going to give you another quote from A Grief Observed, though if you haven't read the book, I'd highly recommend it. It's only around 100 pages and is truly sublime. We were promised suffering. They were part of the program. We were even told, blessed are they that mourn. And I accept it. I've got nothing that I hadn't bargained for. Of course, it is different when a thing happens to oneself, not to others, and in reality, not in imagination. When I was younger, the problem of suffering seemed solvable. In fact, I thought the problem of evil rather proved God than disproved God. If we posit that evil exists, and it surely does, and is an objective thing, and I think it surely is, then God must exist. If materialism is true, then good and evil are just mental constructs, and we can't say the worst crimes against humanity are wrong in any real sense besides saying, I don't like this. Evil would just be illusory, and, well, I think the ontological validity of evil is too present in our world, too undeniable as to dismiss it as something that we merely have a distaste to. I still believe this, but at the same time, it was enough for the problem of evil and suffering to be neatly wrapped into this category of philosophy. I, of course, knew the deep suffering of others, and I thought I understood it deeply enough. To my dismay, I discovered, when entering periods of my own suffering, that I had been selfish. As Lewis says, it's one thing when things happen to others or in our imaginations, and it's another thing when they happen to us in reality. This was a jarring realization that made me realize I had been underestimating my capacity for selfishness. It is one thing to face the problem of suffering from a logical and rational point of view, but it is an utterly different thing to face it from a personal, emotional point of view. I don't think this discounts rational and philosophical arguments. What else do we really have? But we need to have the humility and honesty to not dismiss this prompt so easily.
Why don't you just begin? Why does suffering or evil make God's existence unlikely?
I think when confronted with two hypotheses, so atheism, naturalism, or theism, we should ask what we expect would occur under either hypothesis. And then we look at the world and we see what does actually occur. And what do we find? We find, I think most relevant here, a system of natural selection, the mechanism by which God apparently chose to bring animals and ultimately human beings into existence. A system which is defined by suffering. Survival of the fittest is the same thing as the death and suffering and destruction of the unfit. I'm told that the very mechanism that God chose to bring about the human species as the ultimate end of his creation was one that is imbued with suffering, such that 99.9% of all the species, let alone animals, that have ever existed on planet Earth have been brutally wiped from existence into extinction. And I think that that's less likely on theism. If you assume atheism or materialism, not only do you explain this, you also come to expect it.
Alex's points are undeniably strong and mirror my own journey on this topic, albeit mine being from a religious point of view. When I was a teenager, I didn't believe in Darwinian evolution. Looking back, I think this has far less to do with what I thought it did at the time. At the time, it came from a serious, albeit misguided, attempt to take the beginning of Genesis as serious and therefore literal. To clarify, I still take Genesis seriously, but I think the creation narrative is far more allegorical than it is literal. But I think there's a deeper subconscious revulsion that creationists have toward evolution, and it's exactly what Alex says. For creationists, solving the problem of suffering becomes so much easier. Humans caused the corruption of the animal kingdom and the rest of the world. They introduced viruses and parasites and predation and death, and so while God could still be critiqued for allowing this to happen and allowing it to continue to happen, it seems to just be a better explanation of why things are as they are. But evolution enters as a terrifying specter, one that says, no, God didn't just allow humans the choice to choose between good and evil, and that choice resulted in the suffering and evil you see today. It instead says God chose to use suffering and pain and death as the very vehicle with which to create mankind. Pain and death are therefore not a consequence of human action, they are the originator of human action. This, of course, means that before there were any moral agents even capable of choosing sin, there was already suffering and death present in the world. This flips the traditional Christian narrative on its head, putting the fall after suffering and evil instead of before. Why would a good God choose suffering and death as the very vehicle for creating life? Osiris is an Egyptian deity. He is the god of fertility, the god of resurrection, the god of life. Osiris is a good god. The ancient Egyptians would do a great deal of spiritual practices in order to connect with the gods, in order to uncover the mysteries of the divine, and in order to prepare for death. There is a claim in Western esotericism that during ancient Egyptian initiation rituals, at the apex of the ritual, the initiator would whisper to the one being initiated, "Osiris is a black god." This is alternatively given as Osiris is a dark god with the same implied meaning. While this was repeated by late 18th century and early 19th century esotericists like Eliphas Levi and MacGregor Mathers, I'm unable to find its original source. Nevertheless, when I heard this story, the phrase, "Osiris is a black god," burrowed its way into my brain and remains there till this present moment. If it was the case that it was used during ancient Egyptian initiation rituals, I can certainly see why. What if the awful truth is that suffering and death are not merely the absence of God, but are somehow contained within God? I agree with Alex that given a traditional understanding of God, the problem of suffering feels almost insurmountable. But what if our understanding of God is not full? Going back to C.S. Lewis, in A Grief Observed, Lewis likens his faith to a house of cards. The case is too plain. If my house has collapsed at one blow, that is because it was a house of cards. The faith which took these things into account was not faith, but imagination. The taking them into account was not real sympathy. If I had really cared, as I thought I did, about the sorrow of the world, I should not have been so overwhelmed when my own sorrow came. These quotes, interspersed with Lewis wondering about the very nature of God, reflect to me a broadening of the windows of divinity, a terrifying broadening, do not get me wrong, an awful, horrible broadening, the realization that Osiris is a black god. And now I'm going to try to argue why maybe that's okay, and why maybe it's the catalyst many of us need to expand our faith into something real. As Lewis later says about his faith, in which sense may it be a house of cards, because the things I am believing are only a dream, or because I only dream that I believe them? This is the message of a grief observed. Lewis doesn't stop believing in God over the course of this book. Quite the opposite. I think he comes into a more full, nuanced understanding of reality, God, and of himself. But I repeat myself, twice. Before we move on, I don't claim to know the mysteries of why Osiris is a black god. I also know that Osiris, to continue the metaphor, is a good god, is a god of love, of peace, of resurrection, of hope. But if we look at the majestic pangolin walking around all bipedal like he thinks he's human and we feel awe, we must also look at the parasite Cymothua exigua, the tongue-eating louse, the parasite that severs the blood vessels of a fish's tongue, causing its tongue to fall off, and it reattaches itself to the stub of the tongue, and we must feel dread. Now, I don't know what this means. I think in this universe, how it's been created by God, these things exist. I don't think this means God is equally love and equally hate, and I don't think physical reality is evil and spirituality is good. I don't believe in those dichotomies, but I think we need to acknowledge and truly wrestle with the fact that God has built suffering and death into the very creative process of our planet. I don't think Osiris is a black god is the ultimate truth about God, but I do think on this earth, in these bodies, it is undeniably a profound mystery which we deny at our peril.
What is your, I guess, epistemology? How do you know that this is the case, that it's less likely, and that, an atheist worldview, a naturalistic worldview would look like the way it is today?
Of course we don't know, but that's why I use the phraseology of unlikely. I think that if you were to tell somebody who was sort of in some Rawlsian state of nature, hadn't seen the world, and you said that the world has been created by an omnibenevolent, all-powerful God, what kind of world would that person be imagining?
I think Alex is right that this is not what we'd expect, but I'd argue that this is because we have poor expectations in the first place. Sure, in his example, we might expect to be all experiencing pleasure all the time, and that struggles don't exist and everyone is happy constantly. But what if that's a false expectation? What if we're on this earth to experience something and to grow from these experiences? What if we are seeing the full manifestation of the divine, of reality itself in all of its iterations? Then what would we expect? Perhaps we still wouldn't expect things to be quite so bad. I think that's a totally fair thing to argue, but my point is that from a lower level thought, we might expect that the world would look one way, whereas on another level of thought, we might realize it ought to look a slightly different way. Consider if someone had never read a fictional book or watched a movie or heard a story of any kind, and they were asked what the best story would be. Naively, they might think the best movie would be filled with nothing but happiness and pleasantries for its contained characters. But for those of us who know what movies and books are, aka all of us, we know that this generally isn't the case. Movies and books are better when there is struggle, when there is strife, when there is hardship, and when those struggles and strifes and hardships are overcome. The Christian narrative is that we are in the process of becoming united with God. The Orthodox Church goes even further with this and calls this process theosis, being made into God. This is best reflected in the phrase, God became man so that man might become God. To a modern Protestant, this might sound like some new age insanity, but no, this is some old age insanity, and was said by the 4th century church father and Christian theologian Athanasius of Alexandria. This is what, in my opinion, Protestants commonly get wrong about salvation, or perhaps not wrong, but the focus is often misplaced. Salvation is often seen as a binary moment in one's life. Did you give your life to Christ or not? If so, are you saved? If not, are you not saved? But yet there are numerous New Testament passages that talk about salvation as a process. 1 Corinthians 1:18 says, "For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God." Philippians 2:12 says, "Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling." Now, to give Protestants credit, they do divide salvation broadly into multiple parts, with sanctification being the continual relationship we have with God, but I'd be remiss to not point out that 99% of the time when a Christian says, "I was saved," or "Are you saved?" or "Is he saved?" they mean, did they make that one decision at a singular point in their life and become a Christian? I think it is far more accurate to think of salvation as a process, one of becoming like God, and dare I say, one of becoming God himself in unity. So why am I bringing this up? Well, to me, this aspect of Christianity, which has existed since the founding of the church, far better explains the suffering we experience. We are not here for a good time, though many good times can surely be had and ought to be had. We are here to experience God, to experience reality, to grow, to live, to love, to suffer, to mourn, and to die. We are here to become the fullness of God, and suffering is a part of that fullness. The next part from Alex, I think, hits at this mismatch of expectations.
Okay, so my first question to start out with is what exactly about suffering makes this unlikely on the condition that God exists?
I think that if God is all loving, then he probably wouldn't want his creatures to suffer. And so I think that the fact that they do suffer makes his existence less likely.
This isn't what I'd expect. To go back to Lewis's A Grief Observed once more, what do people mean when they say, I am not afraid of God because I know he is good? Have they never been to a dentist? We at least know that some level of suffering is worth it, and we can see that in this life. It is my experience that suffering has made me a better person. Well, no. Perhaps that's not fully precise. It has made me a wholer person, and as Carl Jung says, I'd rather be whole than good. The suffering I've gone through has made me see things in a more nuanced way, has opened my idea of what God's transcendence means, has molded me into the person I am now, for better or for worse, and in that molding process, it has made me whole. I think many people have this testimony, and yes, I'm sure Alex would point to the examples where this is not the case. Some people take their own life. Some people suffer unimaginable agony that ends in death as mere infants. But I think it is taking the ultimate black pill to think that we only pull meaning out of our suffering out of some kind of cope. I think it is self-evidently true that people grow through suffering, to grow to be more full, to grow to be more themselves. And I'd argue if we know that this happens for so many people, perhaps this can also help explain the gratuitous suffering we see through extrapolation. Perhaps for the cases of animals, or the cases of people taking their own lives, or the infants who die far too early, there's a continuation process. We, from a human point of view, set the apex of the potential for growth at death. But what if this is misguided? I fully understand I can't prove the existence of an afterlife to Alex, nor can I prove it to myself, which is why I'm racked by so much existential dread at bedtime. But if we're talking about God, it's not exactly absurd to think our consciousness in some way could carry on. And in the same way suffering often serves to make us more whole here, it could also continue to make us whole after the grave. The main point is that just as a dentist and a surgeon are hopefully well-intentioned when drilling into our teeth or cutting into our body, and remember, anesthetics were non-existent for the vast majority of human history, it is not inconceivable that God is the divine surgeon, and that life is the process of growing out of the sludge of the animal kingdom, of overcoming the darkness of our own human nature, to reach into the very heavens and become united with the giver of life itself. And it's not inconceivable to me to think that this growth is both necessary and effectual in order to achieve that true union that every human heart longs for.
Okay, perfect. And is there some specific aspect of suffering that you're particularly honing in on, horrendous or whatever
in particular, non-human animal suffering? Because I think that the Christianity has a celebrated tradition of theodicies trying to explain why suffering exists. Yeah. Human free will, the development of the soul, higher order goods, all of this kind of stuff. None of which apply to the suffering of non-human animals.
I think there are two answers to Alex's issues with the problem of animal suffering. Firstly, I would not exclude that everything I just said could also possibly apply to animals, especially animals that are around humans. Anyone who has owned pets know that they seem to become more human the more they are around us, perhaps in a similar way that we become more like God when we are around God. So I would hesitate to dismiss out of hand that animals could be beholden to a similar process of becoming more whole in a similar way we are. Of course, this is easier to see with a domesticated dog than it is to see with a non-domesticated ant, but it shows the potential for this to apply to animals. And in the same way your dog may seem to trust you even after you drag him to the vet for a shot he doesn't understand and has no answer to why you're putting him through this suffering, perhaps that's the attitude we ought to have toward God. And I think it's possible that even for the lower forms of life, there is perhaps also a redemptive process for anything that at least has experiences of consciousness. The second answer is an extension of what one of the debaters says to Alex in this exchange.
So my value theory says that it's not the most important thing about a sentient creature is not what merely happens to them. It's about the total timeline of their life and how and where their life permanently ends. Meaning, if you were to judge an author of a narrative and the first few chapters, let's say, there's a lot of bad things happening, but the end ends with this crescendo where there's victoriousness, there's redemption, there's beauty, and everyone in the story actually endorses their entire existence that they live. They can look at their they can look at their total timeline, and they actually each subjectively come to the conclusion, I'm glad I was made, and I totally see what my suffering was for. That's the particular I'm using with. So We have to judge, hold on, like John Hicks says, we have to judge the very nature of God's lovingness by what he does in the end, not these few time slices that we observe right now. For you to show that there's a problem, you have to show to me that the suffering of animals cannot be transformed, are intrinsically cut off from being transformed into a life that they will endorse. There's a couple of theses on the table, but sure, go ahead.
Okay, so are you talking about the end of their life is in their end of life on earth, or are you talking about the afterlife?
I'm antemortem, postmortem.
Because if you're just talking about life on earth, then I would say that if you had an author writing a book and a character, if we were trying to figure out the relationship between that author and the person in the book, and that person in the book shows up for 5 seconds in the first chapter and is a child who almost immediately dies of cancer in an incredibly painful way, and there's no development, there's no sort of bringing back to life and suddenly everyone's grateful for it. It is just this miserable, tragic experience. And I asked, well, what did the author not want to do for the story of the book, but want to do for that character?
Yes.
I think it would be pretty damning. And also, when it comes to animals, we're talking about animals who are predated on from the moment that they begin existence.
Absolutely.
They sort of have disease. Zebras, when they're killed by lions, are often too big to be killed instantly. So they die over minutes with their windpipes caught in the jaws of a lion.
Sure.
How can this be developing a zebra, which, by the way, probably doesn't even have the same kind of first-person conscious experience that humans do in order to sort of rationalize and abstract and learn from their sort of past and morally develop in that way? They just suffer. And what kind of God could oversee this?
Alex seems to be the most hung up on animal suffering, but I think what this man says is a fair answer to that, especially if we look at the possibility of an afterlife. This ties into a lot of points Alex is saying, but I'd like for him to imagine a creature, human or otherwise, that dies and goes into some type of afterlife. They're happy, they have relationships, they are whole. And let's say that because of the experience of suffering, they're able to appreciate, on an experiential level, the contrast. In a similar way to how the best meal comes after being incredibly hungry, or a warm shower feels best when you've been on a cold hike. And in this afterlife, 3 million years go by. 3 million years of being whole, of being better than they would have been otherwise had they not suffered, experiencing the joys of God far more because of the suffering they experienced. Do you think that creature will look back and say, well, these 3 million years of peace and love and wholeness have been good and all, and I have infinite more positive experiences ahead of me, but that 50-year period of suffering that happened on Earth, I just can't get over that. I don't think so. Perhaps dying is like waking up from an awful dream. Perhaps there will be a sense of, oh, this is reality, and what I was doing before had lessons and pain and strife, but what I'm experiencing now is so much more real, so much more profound, that the pain of Earth is as a distant, foggy memory. I don't think that what I'm presenting here is like Alex's example of someone punching you in the face and then giving you money. The money would be just as good without the punch in the face, but from how we know our brains work on Earth, like with the warm shower or the hot meal example, it doesn't seem ridiculous to think that in this life, our suffering will actually make our wholeness and appreciation that much better once it's over. And to clarify, I'm not saying this contrast makes everything okay. I'm saying the contrast could make things eternally better, both from the contrast point of view and from the wholeness point of view.
If God exists and wants to come to know everybody, and wants to love everybody, and does so for the sake of human beings, why he chose to imbue the world with so much suffering that is at least seemingly completely inexplicable?
Are you a father?
No.
I'm a father. I want my son to become just like I am, better than I am, I should say. I want him to become the best that he can be. Is it possible for him to reach his potential without suffering in his life?
Perhaps not, but there's
so suffering is necessary.
There are a few things I want to say here. Firstly, that kind of moral development doesn't apply to non-human animals, as I've already said, right? That does not account for the brutal death of animals in the wild. Also, if I don't want to talk about your son because it's tragic to think about, but somebody else's son has suffered and died immediately as a result of that suffering, they don't get to develop in the same way.
I think that's why these fatherhood examples can work for some basic level analogies, but fall apart if you look closer. We're fine with our children suffering to a degree for their betterment, but not in any way that's horrific or unnecessary. Otherwise, we think the child parent was a terrible, abhorrent person. With God, we have to an extent, punt into eternity for gratuitous suffering for which we cannot find redemption on this side of the grave. It requires faith that all of this suffering is somehow redeemable and necessary. The same faith your dog puts in you when you take him to a strange building and let a strange man stick him with a needle. It is the faith that this being loves you and that the suffering you're experiencing will make you and is making you, if you'll let it, into God's image after the fullness of time has elapsed. But I really do sympathize with Alex in his discussion because so often Christians have many bad theodicies and bad arguments, and they end up saying the most outlandish things.
There are some instances where maybe a certain amount of suffering brings about a certain amount of good in a situation. That, by the way, would count as a justification. But when a child dies of leukemia, and they're dead.
Could there be a purpose to it? What if the death of the child brings their parents to God?
Then
to
perhaps
salvation?
then the parents should be grateful that their child got leukemia because it's doing the will of the Lord.
Not necessarily.
That seems
All
obscene
right,
to me.
pause.
No.
To think that a child dying of leukemia is redeemed because it had a positive effect on the parents is, of course, mental. I think the earlier things I said that focus on that child are what could possibly serve as an answer, and I fully admit that it's exceptionally difficult to see that happening for children or for people with severe intellectual limitations, but I repeat myself. But to me, it is not an insane extrapolation to see that because this happens with so much suffering on earth, that so many testimonies exist of people being made more whole through suffering, that it isn't absurd to think this could continue after death.
Just because there's maybe not a reason that we can identify doesn't mean that there can't be a reason. Now, it's kind of cold comfort. That doesn't get us 100% of the way there, but it gets us part of the way there.
That's true. So the existence of evil is not logically, or suffering is not logically incompatible with God's existence. But it's a bit like if somebody came up to me right now and stole my friend's wallet in front of me and shot him dead and ran away, and I was grieving, and somebody said to me, well, hey man, you don't know, that person might have worked for the CIA, and your friend might have secretly been harboring the nuclear codes, and killing him might have been good for the country, and he stole the wallet because that's where the codes were. And I would say, well, what evidence do you have for that? And you say, well, look, just because I don't have evidence for it doesn't mean that there might not be some evidence that I don't know about. I would say, until I see why I should think that's the case, I'm not going to believe it. And I'm certainly not going to be less upset in my grieving over my friend because of the possibility that there could be an explanation for it. There's so much suffering imbued in the human experience that if somebody says, well, look, there could be an explanation, it's like, okay, fine, but let me know when you know what it is.
I do appreciate Alex's point here, but I think the analogy misses the mark a tad. In the example of a thief stealing your wallet, you don't have nearly any counterexamples to suggest that somehow this stealing of the wallet benefits you. Yet with suffering, as I've discussed, we have numerous examples of how suffering makes people more whole. Now, of course, I hate suffering as much as the next guy. In fact, I think I hate it more than the next guy. But I am simply unable to deny that it has had a profound effect on my life in a way that makes me more of a complete human being. And to go back to Lewis, I'd like to challenge Alex or anyone watching this video. There's a near certainty Alex has read Lewis's work before, and perhaps he's even read Lewis's A Grief Observed. I'm curious to know, Alex, do you think Lewis was a more complete, changed person after going through the grief or before it? To me, the answer is obvious, and I'm not convinced that Lewis is the exception, especially for those who are thinking seriously about life, trying to find purpose, and trying to live a loving life. Suffering is one of those things that, at the time, can feel impossible to find meaning in. Yet, I think it is one part of the world that changes us into who we are. And yes, with animals, with kids, and with suffering that leads to death, this can be harder to see. But we know of so many examples of struggle that leads to growth, from a biological perspective of muscle building, from a work ethic perspective of delaying gratification for future goals, from a relationship perspective, from so many perspectives that it just doesn't feel like a massive leap in logic to think that after death, this process of retroactively understanding our suffering can also make sense. I'd like to end this video with the last words written in A Grief Observed, where Lewis quotes from Dante's Divine Comedy, a quote that represents the culmination of his grieving process, of his continued declaration of faith in his wife being home, being whole, and being in the true presence of the divine, and a quote that has stuck with me just as much as Osiris is a black god has stuck with me. Poi si terno all'eterna fontana. Then she turned to the eternal fountain. I'm not sure if that's compelling to you, Alex, or if it's compelling to anyone else watching this video. Let me know in the comments if it is, or if it isn't, why or why not. I'd love to hear from anyone watching this in the comments below. I was originally going to respond to all of Alex's prompts, but this one seemed long enough and important enough to warrant its own video. Maybe I'll do other prompts in future videos.
You said, the cinders are falling like snow. There is poetry in despair, and we sang with unrivaled beauty, bitter elegies of symmetry and eloquence of blue and gray.